Okay, so let's dive right in. Today, we're digging into a pretty heavy topic, exploring different analyses of the American dream, 1 year into a hypothetical second Trump presidency. The promise, as you'll see, was monumental, but the reality on the ground, as described in these sources, appears to be something else entirely. I mean, the vision was crystal clear, right? A new golden era for America, built on economic strength nobody had ever seen before. The promise was bigger paychecks, cheaper goods, and a future that was just brighter for everyone. That was the absolute core of the economic message. But then you see a quote like this, taken from one of the source materials, and it just hits you. For so many people, the on-the-ground reality feels completely different. It captures this feeling of widespread financial despair, this sense that the absolute basics of life are slipping out of reach no matter what promises were made. So here's how we're going to break this all down to really understand what's going on. We'll start with that fading American dream, then get into what's being called an economy of survival. From there, we'll look at how the nation is divided, how the rest of the world is reacting, and finally, what all of this could mean for an empire at a crossroads. All right, first up, Section 1, an economy of survival. Let's look at the numbers. What are the actual financial pressures facing ordinary Americans? And why do so many people feel like they're just trying to get by? So before we get into the really shocking data, we've got to understand this key idea. The Minimal Quality of Life Index isn't just about poverty. It's about measuring the cost of a basic but satisfying life. You know, the kind of life that's supposed to be the very foundation of the American dream. And this is where it gets wild. According to the Ludwig Institute's analysis, a staggering 60% of Americans can't afford even this basic standard of living. Think about that for a second. That's the majority of the country feeling like they are fundamentally falling behind. Now look, this isn't something that just happened overnight. The real kicker here is the long-term trend. Over the last couple of decades, the costs for absolute essentials, we're talking healthcare, housing, have just exploded. They've totally outpaced what most people's paychecks can handle. That's the squeeze that makes the dream feel so out of reach. And that long-term squeeze has led to what some in the media are calling a crisis of availability. We're not talking about affording luxuries anymore. As this poll shows, a huge majority of Americans are now struggling to pay for the most basic things you need to live: food, a roof over your head, and medical care. So the big question is, what's driving this? Well, analysts point to a few things, and one major factor that's highlighted is a major tax reform. According to the analysis from the Yale Budget Lab, the reform had a very different impact depending on your income, allegedly benefiting the wealthiest, while the incomes of the lowest earners actually went down. Okay, so that's the economic picture. For our second section, let's see how that stress bleeds over into the social fabric. According to the sources, this widespread economic hardship is a key driver of some incredibly deep political and social fractures across the country. And one of the biggest flashpoints for these tensions has been the administration's aggressive immigration policy, along with the controversial actions of federal agencies like ICE. This has really become a focal point for national debate and protest. And this all came to a head in Minneapolis. As the sources lay it out, what began as a protest against ICE activities spiraled very quickly into a fatal shooting. That single event then triggered widespread civil unrest and even led to the mobilization of troops. It became this powerful symbol of the tension in the country. And you can see that deep division reflected perfectly right here in public opinion. The country is almost split down the middle on this, with nearly half of Americans believing that the actions of ICE are actually making the country less safe. And it's not just politics. When you zoom out, the sources point to some other really troubling social trends. I mean, on these key metrics, life expectancy, public safety, wealth inequality, the US is reportedly ranking poorly when you compare it to other highly developed nations. These are some tough stats to look at. So we have economic stress and social division at home. How does that play out on the world stage? That brings us to our third section. These internal struggles are having a profound impact on how America is seen and how it chooses to engage with the rest of the world. Well, one of the biggest things we're seeing is a major pivot in foreign policy, especially when it comes to China. The language itself has totally shifted. What was once framed as this big ideological battle is now described more like a business rivalry, with China being called a near-peer competitor. And this isn't just talk. It's part of a much bigger strategy. The administration's own security documents basically say, hey, we're pulling back from the rest of the world to focus on our own backyard. This Western Hemisphere first doctrine is a huge shift. So what happens when you do that? At the same time, relationships with longtime traditional allies are getting, well, complicated. The sources describe it as being very transactional, with economic threats and tariffs being used to force compliance. And that is fracturing old alliances and causing some really deep divisions. Okay, this brings us to our fourth and final section, where all these threads, the economy, the social divisions, the foreign policy, all come together. The sources paint a picture of an empire under immense strain, facing huge crises both at home and abroad. Domestically, you have the national debt, which has soared to $38 trillion. I mean, it's a number so huge it's almost meaningless, right? But economists are sounding the alarm about something called fiscal dominance. Basically, the debt gets so big that it starts calling the shots on the economy, forcing the government to potentially devalue its own currency just to manage the payments. And this quote from The Economist really captures how some international observers are seeing the whole situation. The argument is that America's biggest rivals don't even have to do anything anymore. The country's own internal divisions and go-it-alone policies are, in their view, doing the work for them. So, after looking at all this, the sources leave us with one massive, provocative question. Are we witnessing the self-inflicted decline of a global superpower? Or are we watching the painful, chaotic birth of a new and totally different kind of America?